doing this work. And another really important piece as I think about, treatment broadly and coming in to the work that you're going to do with these clients is that compassion on the therapist's part is going to be so important. And I think the Hexaflex basically has compassion built in. So if you think about compassion in its original form, so calm is with passion, it's intensity, with intensity, and in our case, with pain. And we just look at that definition, with pain. Then when we're inside the Hexaflex, that's exactly what we're inviting folks to do. We're open to our emotional experience. We're not clinging to our thoughts. We're here in this moment as a larger sense of self. So I can have whatever pain is there and hold it as a values-based committed action. And so when I think about bringing compassion, I think it is inside the model, and it's there for us to do, meaning we need to engage in acceptance, diffusion, present moment, selfless context as the clinician when we're doing this work. And compassion later on, what was added to with pain is in the service of reducing suffering. So compassion is generally thought of these days as with pain in the service of reducing suffering. And I'm okay with that definition as well, as long as the reducing suffering is about letting go of control or undermining control. So that it's about letting go of the struggle. That's where the suffering is. It's not in the pain itself. And so I think it's nicely inside the model. Okay. So let's continue with stage 1. I'm going to ask Clara Urbano to just mute herself if she wouldn't mind. That would be great. I would mute her myself, but I don't have the capacity. Thank you. Thank you, Clara. So let's begin by talking about establishing safety in the relationship. It's going to be a #1 priority because these folks don't trust humanity, right? Like nobody's trustworthy. And so creating feelings of trust and security and connection are going to be one of your #1 priorities. And we can use the ACT processes to engage in this trusting relationship. I think of it as unconditional acceptance. It does not matter what the client brings emotionally, psychologically, or sensationally. All is welcome. There's nothing they can say, feel, or experience that I can't hold. Now, of course, I'm not going to accept bad behavior, but I'm certainly going to hold all of their internal experiences welcome, including some really terrible memories of trauma, ones that are hard to repeat and ones that I would never share with anybody because they're so painful and terrible. That said, even though you have unconditional acceptance, you also want to be gentle but firm in terms of limit setting. You can do this through modeling and values-based committed action. So when you live in environments where there's no limits and no structure, that feels unsafe, it's unpredictable. And so limit setting, where you start on time and you set limits around how much contact you have with the client, you model limit setting, that's all going to be important. I'm not a fan of too much limit setting. The clients that I work with are pretty good though. I don't, the clients don't send me lots of text just every now and then, which I set up on purpose. But some clients, especially in the complex trauma, like when I work at the supervise at the Bay Area Trauma Recovery Clinic, some clients are texting. I've supervised like several clinicians there, texting those clinicians like 10 times a day. And that you got to set some limits around that kind of stuff, because it's not just about for your protection and that you're not doing therapy outside of therapy and over text. It also creates predictability and structure, which is part of what's needed here. And then the consequences for behavior are important. We want to think about applying consequences in ways that make sense in the session. And I'll talk more about that as we move further. And then one of the things that I'm going to just mention this again, but we're equal in the room. I'm not above the client. It's not power over, it's power with. You and I are working together, and that's going to be what creates a safe place for you to do the work that you're going to do here. And when I'm thinking about creating safety, one of the things I want clients to know that safety is not about eliminating distress. You're working on distressful things. Like your trauma is distressful and it's going to be in the room. And so we can't make safety about you not feeling distressed. That is going to be too hard. So we're going to do it by creating a relational context in which whatever distress is there can be held, that we don't have to avoid and we don't have to fall into overwhelm. You and I will hold this together. I'm going to help the client to learn that I can feel this here with you and I can stay in contact in the room. So safety in this sense lines up much more with ACT when we think of it as the capacity to stay present, not the absence of threat. Because the memories are going to lead to threat. Or you might say things when you're introducing exposure where somebody feels threat. And so I want to organize this right up front with the client so that they know that safety is in their relational space, not in feeling distressed or high emotions. Does that make sense to you guys when I say it that way? When you think about your clients, sometimes we think safety is in no distress, but you're going to have distress when you're working with trauma. I also want to mention that trust develops through moment-to-moment attunement and responsiveness, not necessarily reassurance and validation. So one of the things that can happen when we think we're trying to create safety or trust is to reassure, I'm here with you, it's okay, we've got this, you're okay, everything's going to be all right. And then that just as a general rule, we're told to validate. Like when you think about just clinical rules that exist out there in the world, validation is one of them. You must validate. And I want us to think about it more contextually and functionally. So you validate when it's functionally meaningful to do so. Same with reassurance, that you do it when it's functionally meaningful to do so, not just as a rule. Sometimes you can reassure a client and accidentally reinforce a behavior that is causing them problems in the world. I do also notice that many therapy-wise complex trauma clients will insist that they need validation over and over and over again. And what I've come to understand is if you've been given a lot of validation and things haven't changed, then validation isn't what you need. And so the way I think about reassurance and validation is functional and responsive. It's not as a rule. I don't do it every time the client seeks reassurance or validation. Does that make sense to you guys when I talk about it that way? Especially in complex trauma, you're going to want to track a rupture and repair explicitly. A rupture is not a bad thing in complex trauma. If you can recover, it shows how you can work through things in relationships, especially since those are quite often not worked through in their other relationships. You can name what's happening. We're in a rupture, and stay with this connection rather than moving away from it. Notice what's happening here. Something has shifted between us. What we try to do sometimes is pull back from disconnection. But what we want to do is track what's happening so we can slow down and see what were the events that led to this rupture. And how does that look? Is it just in here, or do things happen like this in your other relationships as well? And those can be very powerful tools for healing and helping to shape healthier relationships. When I mentioned unconditional acceptance earlier, I did also want to point out that it doesn't mean that I'm going to collude with avoidance. So when I see the avoidance, I'm going to address the avoidance. I want to note that acceptance of their experience is not permissiveness of their behavior. So as I'm working with folks in these areas, that remember that firm but compassionate space is still present. And I want that kind of full openness without reinforcing behaviors that lead folks to move away from what matters. I might say, I can understand why you want to shut this down, because clients will do this. And I also want to help you stay with it because it matters. It's important for us to continue here. Will you join me? Will you stay and let's work this through? Those can be very helpful ways, because quite often their learning histories don't have those kinds of experiences in them. I wanted to mention again, firm limit setting. Limits are not control. They're expressions of values in relationships. And what I mean by that is that you can model consistency, predictability, and follow through. And follow through is where the trust is. That's where the safety is. So, like you can model relationships in firm limit setting and remain consistent in messages of no, that's not okay. For instance, right? Like you can stay inside of those messages. You can be predictable, be on time, answer phone calls in the way you've set it up. Tell them that they're only going to respond to emails that are about canceling or rescheduling the session. Or you'll send one email a week. Whatever it is, whatever you've set up, you want to stick with it and create safety through that kind of consistency and predictability. Let's see. I'm just thinking about the time. One of the things that you're going to want to do when you're thinking about this relational process and building a sense of safety is to really drop in to know what's happening for yourself in this work. Working with complex trauma survivors can be really challenging. You've got people who have been permanently damaged as a child through sexual abuse. You've got folks who've lost limbs and been burnt and have scars all over their bodies. And so you're going to be having reactions to these. And so it'll be important not only to be aware of the limits that you're setting and the boundaries that you're setting, but what's happening inside of you as you work with complex trauma. You want to be awake and alive and curious to your internal experiences. Are you getting angry as you're hearing the stories? Are you getting frustrated? Um, I'll share with you, when I was a younger clinician, I worked on a unit for young girls 10 to 12, who had to be rescued from their families due to physical and sexual violence. And it was rough. Like, it was some of the like darkest years of my trauma treatment, because I had to hear the stories of these young girls and, situations where mothers held children down while their father sexually abused them, like really awful stories. And I would leave the clinic and just be devastated and angry, like incredibly angry at the parents who did this to these kids. And so what I discovered is that I was like getting more and more enraged the more I heard, and really had to start looking at what was happening for myself and paying attention to how I was getting fused and hooked on the stories that I was hearing. And didn't know about ACT yet, by the way, at this point in time. And so really struggled for quite some time, and ultimately decided not to work with that population because I was just too mad all the time. I think I could do it now that I have ACT to help me, and now that I practice self-knowledge and I know that I can diffuse and unhook from the stories that I hear from folks. But it initially wasn't easy. And so bringing ACT into your internal sense when you're relating with folks is going to be very, very important. Keep those three senses of self alive. The content that you're going to hold, and you're going to be holding content that they give to you. The process, the unfolding flow, the second sense of self, it's going to roll across time, it's going to rise and fall, and self is context. So your content that's flowing is not you anyway, you're the place where it happens. And that allows me to do that hard interpersonal work in the room, and to carry the challenges and difficulties that show up when people start talking about um, really unseemly events. So the other thing that I think is really important here, as a therapist coming in and creating trust, in addition to knowing yourself and being able to hold the experiences, is that I want to hold the client as whole and capable as well. They are absolutely whole, no matter how many times they've been abused, no matter how much they think they are permanently damaged, that they're disgusting and evil, no matter what thoughts they have about themselves. They are a whole human being. They are a selfish context as well. And they're capable. Growth is possible. And so I hold a genuine faith in the client's capacity to change their behavior. Something can be done. Something can be done. There's so many times where we think that we're just unable to do this, to do something, to make a change. But let me invite you to do something here. I'm going to stop the share for a moment. So I'm going to invite you to reflect on a time Just find a time in your own mind where something you said or did made a difference, made an important difference for somebody. So just take a moment and think of a time when something you said or did made an important difference for somebody. Are you guys able to think of one? And now imagine sharing that with somebody. Imagine that you were we were gonna take turns and we were gonna go around this large room and have each of you, we're not gonna do this, by the way, because there's too many, but imagine that you were gonna share this with somebody, the thing that you did. You might feel a little bit shy or a little bit humble maybe, but think about what you did and the steps that it took to do it, the courage, the capacity. And you could absolutely do it again and bigger. You could do it smaller. You could do it in different ways, right? Like the ways in which we can move in the world and do behavior change is just without number. It's just creativity sometimes that is missing when you can't find a way. And so sometimes when I'm sitting with my clients, I am in full on, let's get creative mode. And I might ask them to reflect on a time when something they said or did made a difference for somebody else. And if they can find it, and what was it, then you've got a place to start. Go, oh, what did you do there? How did you do that? How did you make that unfold? If we did that in another place, what would it look like? And so I'm like eternal optimist in this space where we have the capacity to change and we can make changes. Even little ones done like this across several years and over time make a difference in people's lives. You know, don't have to be great big all the time. They can be little tiny ones too. Like if you have a year of doing little tiny ones versus a year of doing none, it's going to be a different year. And so that's what I want to help create for clients who sometimes feel so stuck that nothing feels like nothing's going to happen for them. And so remember, you have the capacity. You've done it before. You can do it again. All right, let me share again. So something can be done. That's my eternal optimism. And then just to pop back here for a second, one of the things that I appreciate about kind of holding this stance that the client is whole and acceptable, and that I have a genuine faith in their capacity to change, really does help create trust. And it's deeply respectful of the client, in my opinion. Respect means to re-see, like spect comes from the word spectacles, like glasses. And you respect, so you re-see and you re-see and you re-see. And what I'm saying to the client is, I see you. I see you for who you are. And I am going to stand in respect of you, even though others did not do that. I'm going to see you, truly see you. That is deeply respectful and safety creating. I also do deep listening. And what I mean by that is I'm not just listening to the words that they're telling me. I'm listening to body language. I'm listening to micro expressions. I'm listening to tone of voice. I'm listening for emotional language. I'm listening for the function of their behavior. So there's multiple layers of listening. It's not just reflective listening. There's all kinds of listening to help me stay attuned to the client that can be useful in the room. And then, of course, empathy inside of a safely vulnerable and developing relationship is needed. So deep respect, deep listening, and empathy are going to be part of that space. And then we're going to want to really think about how that, so now you've got looking at yourself, thinking about how you're treating the client and creating safety. And then I'm going to give you this kind of wild looking slide here. You've got the relationship, you've got the interaction between you and the client. And I've got all of the processes. If I could make this move, I would make it move, right? You've got your interpersonal experience, the interpersonal experience between you, and then all of the processes that you're working on as verbs: accepting, diffusing, present momenting, valuing. And so you've got the relational process, and that's going to change across time. And what we hope for across time are increases in experiencing and behavioral flexibility. We don't want to forget the body, because the body in trauma is incredibly important. Culture and relationships and history are all going to be part of this interpersonal process that you're going to be working on with the client. So, in the enact, we're often thinking about what context is the behavior occurring in. And one of the things that I want to remind us is that the relationship is a context. And quite often when you see complex trauma, and frankly, I think almost anybody you're working with, problem behaviors that clients emit in session, avoidance, mistrust, assertion deficits, are the same general class of behaviors that they emit with others. That's they're doing with you what they do with other people. And so the additional learning acquired by you, the shaping that you're going to be doing in treatment, is the mechanism of change. And what I might say here is that one thing you want to be alerted to, especially if you have folks who are highly avoidant as a result of their learning history and their trauma, is they can shape you as well. They can shape you out of doing things. They can shape you out of doing exposure. They can shape you out of doing mindfulness. They can shape you, and then they can insist that you need validation, and so you're doing lots of validation when it's not needed. So even though I'm focusing on, in this slide, the problem behaviors that the clients emit, I want to remind us that we can also be, since like this is a full-on interaction here, right? These little lines between the two of us, it's a full-on interaction that we too are being shaped. We are not absent of that outside of the therapy room. So when we're thinking about problem behaviors or things that we'll want to address, we're going to want to think about consequences for certain kinds of behavior. So you'll want to be transparent about it and stay grounded in behavioral principles, making them explicit and relationally held. And so you want to focus on natural consequences based on a functional analysis. You want it to align with your values, so you want to avoid punitive tone, and you want to anchor it in helping them learn and grow in their relational process. So you might end up saying something like, when you pull away, what happened next for you and between us? When you dissociate in the room, I get lost. I wonder if you can continue to ground yourself so you can stay here with me. So those are just a couple of examples, but if you think of like interpersonal patterns that you see in complex trauma, like people pleasing, where the client agrees with everything that somebody's saying and disagrees or avoids disagreement, I might say something like, I know I often, and it's happening to you in the therapy room. Let's say that they're just agreeing with you, their client in the therapy room. I might say, I notice you often go along with what I say. And I can appreciate that at one level, like maybe you're trying to be thoughtful or kind. But I'm also wondering if this might be something in other relationships that puts your needs aside. And if being authentic is important to you, it seems like that gets lost in the agreement process. Like, where do you go? So I'm naming it in real time. I'm making it values linked in terms of authenticity. And I'm trying to shape in session, what could you do differently here? What would happen if you disagreed with me? What are you afraid of? So then you can work on whatever, showing up to whatever fears are in the room if they're come out of that people pleasing place because of their trauma history. Maybe they're dysregulated and their anger, they have anger or something like that, and you're in session and they're being quite reactive, or they're escalating in the way that they're behaving emotionally. And so I might say something like, so I'm issuing consequences, right? I might say something like, I can see how strong this feeling is right now. And it makes sense that your learning history would show up in this way, especially given what you've been through. But we need to pause here. And I might even use my hands as a signal for, we need to slow down. Now, things are moving just a bit too quickly, and it's pulling us into reaction rather than responding. I want to pull us back to responding. Can we slow down and see if we can do the responding together? So I've named the behavioral pattern, reactivity, and I've linked a different response, a behavioral pattern, to responding versus reacting. And we now have a new way to move forward. I might have to do it several times, but I've got a way to work with the client that's about interrupting reactivity and moving into being responsiveness. I guess I'll give one more example of boundary setting. Let's say maybe some of you guys have clients like this, like you have a client that texts repeatedly, and it's outside of the agreed boundaries in your texting. You might end up saying something like, I want to talk about the messages that I'm getting between sessions. I care about staying connected and I care about supporting you, but I also want to be clear that responding outside of session in this way is not actually going to support the kind of stability and independence you've said you wanted. So let's hold the boundary and we can work together on ways to help you get there. So I'm just stating, let's hold the boundary. It's firm, but not punitive, right? Again, staying transparent, values linked as much as possible. So let me just pause. I've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes. I probably have about maybe 10 or 15 more slides. Let me just pause for a moment and see if you have questions. I've been focusing on stage 1, safety, building, finding ways to respond to clients that are firm yet supportive. Let me see if there's any questions at this point. There may not be, but let me just double check. If not, I'll go back and move forward. Thank you, Adrian. It does look like Jose has a question. He says, I can hear from your presentation that you talked about ACT and FAP, which I found excellent, and I thank you for it. If you had to choose one book on trauma and ACT FAP, which would you recommend for those of us just starting out on this path? Well, so Jose, we're in the process of writing the second edition of ACT for Trauma and PTSD. It's going to be way better than the first one because we wrote that in 2007 and it's almost 20 years later. And so we've learned a lot, Dara and myself, we've learned a lot. And so we're in the process of upgrading. And so I'd wait to get the upgrade. Otherwise, I think if you want to look at ACT and trauma, I'd probably do You Are Not Your Trauma. If folks know this book, I'll type it in here. You Are Not Your Trauma. It's a self-help book, but it's laid out in such a way that clinicians can use it as well. And you can do the work in there. And it walks you through the stages, just like I'm going to be talking about today. And you can get it at, I think at Guilford. You can find it there, or Amazon probably has it too, but it's You Are Not Your Trauma. Dara and I wrote that, and I think I think that we put our hearts into it, and we have 60 years of work with clients who've been traumatized. And so I hope that's conveyed in the book, right? That all those years of working with trauma, I hope, are there. All right, so Hirsan says, could you share with us a short example of how could we trace the thin line between giving space and validation so that the person in front of us does not feel overwhelmed by exposure and us giving into avoidance repertoire? So Hirsan, I'm a little confused by the question. Can you clarify? You speak English? Do you want to come on and just chat with me? I see you there. You want to just, yeah.
Yes, I was talking about when we see a person that is suffering, we may feel in need to just give them space. But the question is about how can we trace the line between being a therapist who is validating their suffering and probably the urge to move away from touching that hard feeling. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Well, so I definitely validate clients' experience, especially their trauma, right? And if they're in a challenging space, I want to just try to hold it and be present to what's happening. But I am going to look for a pattern of the client needing validation. And what it looks like is it's not that validation isn't working. Like you validate and they need more, and you validate and they need more. Like it's like an endless well of validation is needed. And you can give as much validation, you could validate, and nothing changes. And so I'm going to look for a pattern like that first. And if I see that pattern, then validation is not going to be the answer, even though the client may be saying, you need to validate me. I can kind of give you an example. And let me see if this answers the question, Hursam. So I worked with a client who is not exactly a trauma client, but had many of the features of somebody who had trauma. But it's an example of wanting validation, and validation was not what he needed. And so he had was always teaching people, teaching, and relationships were not going well for him because he's come into a relationship and teach you. And I don't know how you feel about that, Harrison, but I want to be in a relationship where we're able to have a conversation, right? And it's not just somebody talking at me and teaching me all the time. And what happened is that he got a piece of feedback about it in an important moment where somebody just said to him when he was teaching, blah, 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 which I thought was probably the best move somebody could make to help him, like, see that the teaching was not wanted. And he came to therapy the next day, and he was just like outraged, and I need to be validated, and I didn't do it because he wanted me to validate his outrage, and he wanted me to validate that he was doing it right, and he wasn't. It's true. This behavior was problematic and need to be punished, not validated. So, does that make sense, Hersan? And most importantly, am I answering the question?
Yes, it's answered. Thank you a lot.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. And so you really have to watch for when validation is functioning to keep the person stuck. Then you don't want to do validation. You can give them space to feel their feeling, but maybe just no validation. You just withhold the validation and just sit silently, see what happens. Yeah. Let me take 2 more questions and then I'll go back. Let's see. Did I lose the question? There we go. I thought somebody asked me for an example. Could you give an example of how to avoid over-validating in the session? Oh, well, could I give you an example? I suppose what I would do is stay out of content and stay in function. So if somebody is seeking a lot of validation in the session, and I'm thinking that this over-validating is not working, then I'm going to speak to the function and not the content, because validating is often content-oriented, can be content-oriented. And so I might say something like, let's just notice what's happening right now. Can you stay with this feeling of uncertainty? Can we hang in there and not know the answer or not move to try to fix something in this moment? So it might look something like that. I hope that's a good example. What key consideration should a multidisciplinary team working together in a psychiatric clinic keep in mind when treating individuals with trauma? Recently, a client relived her trauma and began hitting furniture and hurting herself. When we physically restrained her, she screamed that we were making her relive her trauma even more. Well, so one of the things that I would absolutely have everybody on the multidisciplinary team do is know how to ground and be good at it. So that if you have somebody in your clinic who starts to hit things, I want to ground first. And I would use the restraints like in the absolute last circumstance. And probably wouldn't use them at all unless she was trying to harm other people. So sometimes grounding takes a long time, so you have to persist. If somebody's really distressed and revved up, like I worked with a client once who was having there's a new name for them now that's slipping my mind, but having false seizures. Pseudo seizures is the old name. Does anybody know the new name? There's a new name for it now, where there's no electrical activity, but they're having a seizure. So that's what would happen to her when she'd get distressed, is she'd go into these like, seizures where they were pretty dramatic. And I probably had to sit with her for, I'm guessing, 10 to 15 minutes, which is a long time if you think about sitting with somebody and trying to help them ground. But I was just patient. She was just kept doing that. And I just said, I want you to hear my voice. I want you to hear my voice. Tune in to me. I'm here now. You're on the floor. Feel the floor. So I just kept with it. And then finally she came out of it and sat up, and we sat on the floor and talked for, 15 minutes, and she was able to get herself together and go back to the room. And she'd injured herself a little bit because she was hitting the floor, but it was okay. She was okay. And so it's just, everybody there should know how to do it, and they should know how to do it well, and they should persist. Does that help, Armando? I'm looking at you over here. Okay. Yeah.
Absolutely. I felt the same. This client was like having false seizure and she ended up in the floor. So
Yeah. So you get down on the floor with her. That's exactly what I did. And I used a very calm, low voice. Let's be here now. Let's be here now. I'm here. Make eye contact with me, right? And you just have to, sometimes it takes a little bit of time. Yeah. Okay. How do we develop self-care? Oh, be good to yourself with ACT. Use ACT on yourself so that you are more than the stories you hear. You can hold all the stories and they're not you. And be really aware of your emotional experience. Take good care of your body. Don't overload on too many clients. The other way, and one of the best ways you can prevent burnout, is training and supervision. Those two things have the best outcomes for helping to prevent burnout. People get burned out when they don't know what to do and they're not getting supported. So training and supervision are your best two alternatives. What are effective ways to respond when a client with complex trauma goes into a freeze response during session? So get them back in the room and have them move. So if they're in a freeze response, let's say I'm in a freeze response. I'm the client, and I'm just like, I had a client sometimes who would do this in the room. Like that was her posture. She'd come into the room and that was her posture. And she'd just stay stuck in it, right? And so get them to move. Hear my voice, and I want you to just do a little stretch. I want you to just move your arms around a little bit. I want you to sit up in the chair because you're breaking the response, right? So even if it starts with a little movement, stand up, stretch, get yourself moving again is the key thing. And you can let clients know they're going to do that too. If you see that they freeze, okay, when you freeze, what we got to do is get in the moment and then break the freeze. And so that's, I have clients move. I stop what I'm doing and I have them move basically. And sometimes it takes a little time and encouragement, but getting them to move is how you help them get out of that freeze response. In your experience, have there been cases where ACT is not the best therapeutic approach for some reason? Hey, good question. Let me think for just a minute. I'm only coming up with one case. I mean, there are other ways to do trauma treatment, like PTSD for sure. Like I could do straightforward prolonged exposure if I had just a straightforward PTSD case. But it's based in behavioral principles, and so it lines up so nicely with ACT that I see them as married, not outside of each other. And I use a lot of ACT in the post-processing part, when you're after you're done telling the trauma, and then you're doing the processing of the telling. I use a lot of ACT in that area. I only had one client many years back. His trauma was he almost died. He had an embolism to the chest, and he was very afraid of any he was in the hospital for like 3 months, and he was very afraid of any little tweaks or experiences that he had in his chest. So if he felt a little ping or a pain or something like that, he would immediately run to the emergency room and think he was having another embolism. But for 3 years of that, he wasn't having any embolisms. And so he came to me to get help for panic and anxiety, PTSD. And I did some creative hopelessness work with him. And he came back to the second session and said, I get what you're telling me, but I don't want that. I want these things to go away. And so I need to find another therapist. And I said, okay. So I guess when I think of him, is the control was so important that it wasn't going to matter how much undermining of control I did. It just was a choice he was making. So I suppose there might be folks who self-select. I think you have to be careful if you're working with folks who have some kinds of personality disorders, like psychopathy. They often end up in front of you though because they have to. But with almost every case I work on, I'm using ACT in some way, shape, or form. I mean, it's just built in now, right? I don't think even if I tried, I don't think I could not do it. And so it's like one of those issues, right? Where I've just been doing it so long that I'd have a hard time not doing it. In fact, when I was getting trained in PE, I went through the full process, right? Where they monitor you and they listen to your sessions. And my supervisor who was teaching me kept telling me, you've got to stop using ACT metaphors while you're processing. But they were beautiful. They worked perfectly where I was using them. And but she wanted me to just do it, I don't know, no metaphors, I guess. I passed the class. So I guess I did it good enough. Anaya Sin?
Hi, yes. I, well, I'm so impressed by the way that you are able to put like to bring everything to the surface without, I don't know, without oversimplifying, this topic so complex like trauma. So thank you. Really, I appreciate your work. I don't know. And well, it's not a question. Actually, it's more like a comment or a reflection because, sometimes it's like the world, it seems like the world is full of harm, but I think that, yeah, because harm is love there, right? But I think that world keeps like moving forward thanks to people that are working like this, like so thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you. All right, so what I'll do is that's very kind compliment. Thank you, super appreciated. Let's pop back to the PowerPoint and let's see if we can get us through the other stages here. Okay. I do want to just say a little bit more about equal power with versus power over. I mentioned it earlier, but one of the things that I can so appreciate about the work that we're doing is we really are inside of a shared humanity. And probably every single one of you knows somebody who's been traumatized, or you've been traumatized yourself. And so I think, keeping ourselves humbly inside of that space is really important when we're doing this work. And when you are doing an equal power, a power with rather than over, you're not abandoning your clinical responsibility. You're decentering your dominance. Because as a therapist, the client, especially if they're people pleasing and they're used to not having values and looking for help outside of themselves, you'll sort of drift up into a one-up space. And so in some ways it's on us to bring that space back. Power with looks like transparency and collaboration and willingness to be impacted by the stories that you're hearing. Of course, you hold structure, direction, and judgment, but you're in it together with the client for the long haul. And I'll guide you when it gets hard, but I'm going to listen to you and what's happening for you. You need to tell me. And when you're in that space, you're creating something that is got kind of a nurturing flexibility in it. And that relationship creates a consistent, non-judgmental space where flexibility can arrive. And the therapist is modeling, reinforcing, and nurturing those flexible behaviors inside that relationship. So I like the idea of nurturing flexibility when we encompass all of these spaces. So with that said, there's a few things that you'll want to think about, structural considerations when you're in stage 1. And I'm going to mention some things you can do here, but I just wanted to lay these out first. You can use a number of the metaphors and exercises, but what you might do, depending on where the person is at, are they dissociating a lot? Are they emotionally aroused a lot? Do they need to be doing more skills in smaller chunks? Or do you need to take pieces of the metaphor and say a piece of the metaphor if you're going to use a metaphor? So, for example, in the physicalizing exercise, I typically have the client do 3 sets of emotions, one after the other, that they physicalize and give an image to. But if somebody's struggling in the way these folks can struggle, I'll just do one and then pull it back again. And then maybe the next session I'll do one again and pull it back again. So I'm just putting it in smaller chunks. More in-session practice can be very useful. Let's practice grounding. Let's practice being mindful. Let's practice what you're going to say. I think all of those things could be helpful. And you might want to consider adaptations to include more concrete connections. Like, we're asking clients to talk about really difficult things, and sometimes drawing those or music that represents it. Other ways of sort of evoking the emotional experiences that are needed can be there. And getting out of your chair and doing activities, sometimes just walking as a way to, connect with your client in a different kind of activity, can be helpful. You always want to be teaching in an emotionally activated state to enhance learning. So if they're not emotionally activated when you're doing exposures, for instance, it's probably not going to work as well. I often use audio recordings. So if I'm doing an exercise in session, I have them turn on the recorder on their phone so they can practice it at home. And then if you give homework, which I think you should, you want to track it. Have them practice out a session to instantiate the learning of the skills that you're asking them to do. And so what are those skills? Well, we're going to increase willingness and and diffusion, diffuse from mind, so that we can get into an openness to what's happening and experience emotion without it being seen as harmful or without doing it in unworkable ways that involve avoidance. And so we're going to recognize the parts of emotion. What thoughts tend to come along with it? What are the physical sensations? Are there any urges that arise when you have this emotion? We're going to acknowledge, describe, observe. So we're really just helping folks who haven't had a lot of emotional training really get in touch with and describe what it is that they're experiencing while taking a non-judgmental stance. So we're making space for clients to move into emotional experience, even when it's intense and unwanted. Reminding the client that they don't have to like the experience might be a good thing to do here. It's not about liking. It's a stance of openness. So we're going from control to openness. We're going from avoidance to contact. And differentiating the components of the emotion can be quite helpful because emotions are not just one thing. We tend to think of them as one thing, but they're not. They're a set of processes, thoughts, physical sensations, urges kind of rolled together. And so you want to make sure that they're understanding that emotions are more complex than the way we talk about them. Words don't always describe them. And so we want to acknowledge, describe, and observe. And that's going to be very helpful for somebody who's struggling with these kinds of things. We're moving to, once they can acknowledge, describe, and observe, and they can diffuse from them, diffuse from the thoughts and feel the emotion, then they're going to be less reactive because those experiences are learned to not be dangerous. And we're changing how the behavior is organized in their presence so that they can learn to see and do versus do and run. Does that make sense to you guys? The way I just said that. You step out of that urgency. And here's a couple of examples of skills that I do in stage 1 that are around willingness. Like some of these you will have heard of. Emotion surfing, in noticing the rise and fall of emotions. And invite them to notice without fusing because their mind is going to have things to say about it. Also notice the desire to escape, but stay. Right, so you can see I'm inviting multiple levels of noticing. So it's the rise and fall, notice the thoughts, notice the desire to escape, and then notice the urges and impulses without acting on them. So you can see the layers of noticing in there, and you could do one at a time to start and then build them all in together. And then use emotion activation during the exercise by connecting to distressing experience that is not about the trauma. So as we're helping people show up to emotional experience and trauma treatment, quite often they want to avoid in session because they think you're going to take them right to the trauma experience. But what you can do is ask them to work on something that's painful, but not about the trauma, some other experience. And you can do multiple ones of those as ways to give them a learning history with emotion surfing. And then when you move to the trauma, they'll have some practice first. They'll know what they need to do so they don't get caught up in the trauma and then lose the process. So you can start with relatively low emotional activating and then move up higher as the client becomes more skilled at observing. I also want to help them increase the capacity to live more fully in the moment. This assists with emotion regulation and values-based choices. It's hard to regulate when you're sort of caught up in your head, and it's hard to know what you want to do when you're trying to run. And so present moment awareness could be very helpful in stage 1, and I want to focus it on particular things, especially the senses. So these are a few skills examples that you could use here. touch, what do you see, hear, taste, smell? Tell me 3 things you can see. Tell me 3 things you can hear. Touch 3 things and notice the texture of them. That's a great grounding, and it's present moment as well. There's a number of different grounding exercises that you can do to help people be here now, get back into the moment. Some of these are a little bit more distracting, like there's soothing grounding, which might be doing something like thinking of your favorite things. Like if you're really hyped up and highly emotional, you could say something to the client, tell me your favorite kind of music. Tell me your favorite season of the year. Tell me your favorite TV show. Do you have a favorite animal? So you're just sort of getting into a space where you're calming the system a little bit by talking about favorites. Physical grounding, push your feet into the floor, stand up, push your feet into the floor, grab onto the edge of the chair, fill the chair, hold an ice cube in your hand, take a big drink of cold water, feel the water go down your throat. And then mental is really just, what's today's date? Where are you? Who's the president? You know, those kinds of things, just to help them get engaged mentally. You might need these from time to time when you're doing exposure, especially if the client begins to dissociate while you're doing that. And then you can do breathing exercises, and there's tons of those out there that are helpful. With the self as context process, I definitely want to expand or build the sense of self, especially if it feels low and missing. I mean, the whole point here is to reduce the threatening quality of emotional experience. And so that sense of self is intact, then you're going to be in a much better shape to recognize the moment of choice. And so some examples of experiences that I might do there is, and these can be super helpful with perspective taking, for instance, distinguishing between now and then. So, for instance, trauma often can collapse time, if that makes sense, where people's time might feel a little bit out of sync, or they feel like they're stuck as young children, or they weren't allowed to grow up properly, and so time can have kind of a funny quality to it. Past experiences can feel like they're happening now. You know, just that activation gets things going. And so doing things like you are here now versus you were there then can be quite helpful. We re-anchor people in the present, but also help them experience that sense of continuity. You were there back then and you are here now. You're the same person across time, but you're not stuck in that moment of trauma. You're now in another place. So you can sort of see how that you here now versus you there then can be helpful in pulling them back and forth in time and helping them to discriminate adult, child. Younger, more vulnerable, older, able to take care. What you could not do then, you can do now, right? So you're pulling back and forth between those two spaces, and the self as context underlies it all as a way to draw the distinction between the power that you have as an adult versus the power you didn't have as a child. And then it also helps you to distinguish between self and other, right? Boundaries are crossed a lot. And so you can ask questions like, if you were your partner and your partner were you, what might you see and feel? So you sort of get, and what do you feel as you sit in this space first? So you can help distinguish experiences this way. And what that does is create an ownership of the experience. Notice how they did it differently than what you might have done. And so you have another way of viewing things and seeing things. You have your own opinion. And so that distinguishing can be very important. I think if you get into this kind of perspective switching space, you can reduce fusion with a single narrative. I'm a trauma survivor. You can help broaden that kind of narrative such that the identity doesn't have to be fixed or singular in any way. And so I think these are great little exercises for contacting the here and contacting the now. You can do something like this, in fact. Bring your mind to a younger version of yourself, a time when you were overwhelmed. You guys can try this. Bring your mind to a younger version of yourself, a time when you were perhaps struggling or overwhelmed. Notice what that version of yourself was feeling, what they believed about themselves, and what they could or couldn't do. Now gently shift and notice yourself here, right now, in the room that you're in. Be aware of your body, your breath, and your current age, your current capacity. And see if you can hold both at the same time. You are here now and you were there then. And from where you are now, just notice, what can you do now that the younger version couldn't? What perspective do you have now that the younger version didn't have access to? And again, notice that you are both these versions. So that's just a sort of short, I shortened it just because of time, but that's a kind of short exercise you can do with a client to help them sort of draw those distinctions and start to come into a sense of ownership of self. I see some questions coming in. I'll answer those in just a moment. Let me just get through a couple more slides. And then engaged in values. And of course, I'm doing this all across the therapy where I'm clarifying and helping them reconnect, sometimes even kind of building what's values for them because they feel so far away. I want to inspire hope for living in this space. Finding meaning following extensive trauma can be challenging. And so building that sense of trust and hope is important. And so again, focusing on their capacity to change and to live their values, even when they're feeling triggered by the past, is very important. And there's a number of skills work you can do here too. So for instance, big emotions are often about important things. So if somebody's having a big emotion, tell me what's happening here. Rage, sadness, panic, what is that about? Is it about rejection and loss? And what does that mean? You want connection and to be a part of. Or interpersonal difficulties like conflict and dependence. Those might be about control, but if you look more closely, control so that you feel safe or you get to have love, right? Like you can find the values-based work inside of those things. And one of the things I want to do in the values area, given that trust is such a big issue, is remind the client that the value of trust is about essentially being reliable and responsible, but it's for you to do. So trustworthiness isn't necessarily out there. We can't always count on that out there, but will you do it? Will you be trustworthy in your behavior and not be aggressive? Will you be trustworthy in your behavior and not be impulsive, not misuse substances, not engage in self-destructive behavior? You have a trustworthiness to uphold here if that's what it is that you're seeking in the work that you're doing. And then finally, I want to, getting engaged. The behaviors of living well are going to be important. You want them matched up with their values. And so some of the things I might invite them to do is opposite action. Actions that move attention to get a break, like gratitude lists, talk to a friend, spend time outside, focus on relationships, set boundaries, be honest. Of course, reduce substance use and take good care of your body. These are all examples of skills that can be done. And then I'm going to move into stage 2. And I'm actually going to come out of the slide here. I'm going to move, after I've done some skill building here, I'm going to move into stage 2. And what I'm going to do there is direct exposure to the trauma. And so let's say somebody has, I'll give you an example. The woman that I told you whose brother had sexually abused her from age 3 to 15. It's over 12 years of her life. That's a lot of sexual abuse to cover, right? And so what do you do? And I had her pick the one that was the one she remembered best and she found most difficult. And we did a written exposure therapy process with that one, where she gave me the trauma front to back. We start here and end here. And she wrote for 30 minutes in great detail about what happened. And typically what you want to do is do this multiple times when you're doing that kind of exposure, so that you get a new learning. And essentially what's happening there is they're inhibiting the avoidance response. And so she wrote it the first time, and when I got it back, she was saying things like, he put his thing on my thing, right? So she's using language that's telling me what's happening, but it's not descriptive. So in the second writing, when I had her do it again, I asked her to please use the correct body language. He put his penis on my vagina, right? So, and that got her more activated, which is what I wanted, so that she could process and be with, as we taught in stage 1, the emotional experiences that she was having. And then we did 3 more writings, and they had impact and future outcomes in them. It worked quite well for her. It took about a week and a half, and then she was thinking about it and burst into tears and felt like something had really shifted for her. So I'm going to do some kind of focused trauma work in complex trauma. And it's just because with complex trauma, there's so many different traumas. I usually go for the one best remembered and the worst, best remembered and the worst to start. And then I might have to do more depending on how much progress they make. And I usually put time in between doing other traumas. Sometimes you can do one and it works great. Things get improved substantially, but sometimes you have to process multiple traumas when you've got complex trauma. So then I move into stage 3, and it's all about reconnection and values and growth and resiliency, with values related to resiliency, and I support them in that work as they step forward. So that's what I'll present, and I'm happy to answer these questions. And so let me just take a look at a few of these. Let me see. I'm going to just work my way backward a little bit here. I think I got that one. I got that one. I got that one. And that one. Okay. So this is from Jose. Many clinicians work with addiction, chronic illness, and other presenting problems rather than trauma specifically. Given the high prevalence and possible under-recognition of trauma, would you recommend approaching all clients from a trauma-informed perspective by default, or should trauma be explicitly screened? I think it's a tricky question. I think you should explicitly screen for trauma. The issue is that sometimes people will have trauma and not report it, especially if they think it's not relevant to why they're going to therapy. But you should try, and I would ask about it directly. Have you had any trauma in your history? Just ask about it in your intake evaluation so that you have an understanding of the trauma and know a little bit about how it's playing out in their life. Now, trauma-informed is interesting. Part of the issue with trauma-informed is people don't know what it means. There's so many different ways to be trauma-informed, and there's been some research done on it recently that shows that it doesn't really seem to make a difference, or that it's too messy. And so I think that really what we mean here is to know if your client is traumatized and to know if they need trauma treatment. And are you the one to do it? Are you trained, or do you need to refer them somewhere else? And something that's interesting is, like, you can be working with a client for a year and a half, let's say, and then they tell you, oh, by the way, I had a trauma, right? There's just no kind of direct line where people will share these things with you. So yes, I think we need to ask and screen, and still we may not get the right answer, but we should do it anyway. And that maybe I'll send you guys a little bit of literature on trauma-informed and some of what's being said, just so you have a sense of an update on it. I'll shoot it over to the chapter, and then they can send it out to you guys. Because it's not as straightforward as trauma-informed is not as straightforward as you would think. When the patients, and by the way, part of that is that they say they don't want you to re-victimize the client, but you are not re-victimizing the client. I really want to make that clear. It's a terrible name, and it scares clinicians because it makes it look like you're re-traumatizing the client, and that's not what you're doing by asking them a question or inviting them to do exposure. That's not what's happening. You are not a perpetrator. Are you with me? Yeah, and we need another name for it because we've given it a terrible name and it scares clinicians, and it's unfortunate. But I'll send you some information on trauma-informed. When the patient's present situation is the problem because they're actively experiencing the trauma, creating difficulty and resistance to connecting with the present. If they're actively experiencing trauma, like let's say it's a domestic violence case and the woman is staying with the partner and the partner continues to be violent, I'm going to create a safety plan in case they decide to go. I'm probably not going to do exposure, but I'm going to instead stay in stage 1 and do straightforward stage 1 stuff. I'm going to look closely at values and what values are being lost in this area by staying with a violent partner, and support them in the best way I can to either get their partner and them into therapy or to leave the situation where they're being physically abused. So the situation does matter, and in lots of different ways. Like I was once doing work with a client where we were starting exposure. She'd been brutally raped 3 times and wouldn't look at her body, right? So she took all the mirrors out of her house, and she wouldn't look down when she got dressed. And so we started exposure with having her look at her toes, and we were going to work her way up her body so that she would get some exposure. And in the middle of it, she came to a session and said, I'm losing my house and I'm not going to be able to come back anymore. So situational circumstances can mess things up, all over the place. And so you do want to be aware of those. Can a traumatic experience be explained through karma and reincarnation in order to learn lessons about actions we did? Ruben, I do not think so. Like somebody got traumatized because they had bad karma in a previous life, is how I'm understanding that. I guess I don't think of karma working that way. And that I probably don't have a good enough understanding of it to say yes or no on that one. I think I've had a few lessons on karma, and I don't think it works like, let's go target that person and make them suffer for a past life event. But I could be wrong, or I could be thinking about a different kind of karma. Hi, thank you, Matthias. Do you have a specific order or method in your practice for starting with given the number of symptoms and the urgency of various issues in different situations? And so, okay, is there a particular order or criterion you always recommend for starting with so many different approaches? I almost always start somewhere in creative hopelessness to some degree or level, right? I would say that that's typically my way in, and then it's just whatever makes sense after that. But that would be probably my only general rule, is I want to understand what's not working for the person. And so that's but other than that, I think you can start almost anywhere. There's a question by Jenny, but somebody will have to translate for me. Mm-hmm. I would first say that's very well. So there might be a couple reasons why that could happen. One might be they were close to a psychotic break anyway. They were on the edge anyway. Two might be the therapist went astray in some way. You do want to know how to do exposure if you're going to be doing exposure. But three, that's very rare. It's very rare that something like that happens, that a client, in all my years of work, I've never had it happen. And I've seen thousands of trauma clients. And I can't think of anybody I know. Wait a minute. I'm having a vague memory of maybe one person, so it's very low rate. I think then you want to get them grounded and get them more help, right? You want to get them grounded and get them more help. And it's not that I would not do the trauma work after that. I still might, but I'm gonna consult with people about it and what it should look like and how I'm gonna do it. So I hope that answers the question. It's just so rare, I really don't have much to say about it. I think I've answered all the questions. It's about 7 minutes after the time. And so I say we go have fun on our rest of our Saturday. So therapists, this is Myra. Myra, therapists do fear re-victimizing their clients. And what I'm saying is you're not re-traumatizing your clients. You're not a perpetrator. You're not sexually assaulting them. You're not physically beating them up. Probably what's happening is you're asking them questions that's getting their arousal and distress up. Well, that's what you're doing in exposure anyway, but you should know how to do the work, how to do the grounding, how to manage a situation if they're getting really amped up and unable to help themselves ground. And so part of what I want to do is write an article on this and change it from, because then in a way it almost sounds like it could be taken in two ways. How do we avoid treating clients with trauma because they're going to be aroused? Do you see what I'm saying? And that's not going to be helpful. There are some things that might be re-traumatizing. Like I've heard of people doing inappropriate things, right? Inappropriate things. And that could be traumatic. But I guess I want to be really thoughtful about it and do no harm. And you probably will not be re-traumatizing your client as just a general rule for now. We need to work more on this topic that has become such a terrifying thing for clinicians. All right. So I hope I did a good job answering your questions, and I think I better write about re-traumatization, and you guys will have to, so I can sort it out a little bit more. It's so lovely to see all of you. Thank you for being here on your Saturday afternoon.
César,
Yeah.
preguntan por aquí si el material que nos dijo que compartiría nos lo mandaría o cómo le vamos a hacer.
So I'm going to I'll share my PowerPoint. I'll put that in PDF, and then I was going to share article on re-traumatization, or I've got to write it down or I'm going to forget. So I'll share the PowerPoint. And I'm going to share the piece on trauma-informed care. So I'll share those two things. A couple of articles. Does that sound good? I think. Okay, fabulous. Fabulous. I'll try to get them off to you. I mean, right now I'm going to go play in my backyard, but I'll try to get them off to you. Yeah. I hope you guys have a good rest of your weekend, and thank you so much for inviting me. Glad to be here today. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Gracias, Rosy.
Barbie. Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias a
Okay.
todos, a todas por conectarse. Pues los seguimos invitando a nuestras siguientes sesiones. Digo, ahorita ya se nos fue Robin, hubiera sido lindo tomar una foto general, pero bueno. Seguimos celebrando nuestro tercer aniversario y bueno, esperemos que pues verlos en las siguientes emisiones. Ya saben, pueden seguirnos por nuestras redes, Facebook, Instagram. Esta transmisión se va a repetir la mitad en YouTube. Amablemente nuestro compañero Humberto, que es como de redes, que es súper bueno en estas cosas, nos ha ayudado mucho en que se guarde la segunda parte con la traducción de César. Y bueno, pues nada, muchísimas gracias por su asistencia. Los esperamos ver en la siguiente sesión. En este momento no recuerdo cuál es. Nos tocaría el 13, ¿verdad? Con
13.
Osvaldo, el 13
No.
de julio.
Birmari me parece que está antes.
Ah, sí, Birmari.
Parece que es el 13.
Birmari
El 11.
11
Birmari el
de
11.
César el 13. Y bueno, esperamos verlo por los demás eventos por allá. Muchísimas gracias por su asistencia, cuídense mucho y a disfrutar el fin de semana.
Gracias.
Cuídense. Ah, José Antonio. Sí.
Gracias,
Sí,
muchas gracias. Que no pude escuchar lo último. ¿Por dónde ustedes nos van a poder mandar el material que
sí.
Walter que no va a compartir?
Es que,
Claro.
Antonio, estás, ¿eres miembro del capítulo? Te lo pregunto porque si es así, podríamos mandar el material a los miembros del capítulo y ya te llegaría en automático, pero si no, entonces mándanos tu correo electrónico al capítulo al correo del
Sí,
chapter y ya
no,
te...
no estoy inscrito en el capítulo de ustedes, pero sí lo tengo pensado porque estoy interactuando bastante y me gusta mucho toda la actividad que ustedes tienen. Los quería felicitar también por lo bueno que lo están haciendo. Son un
Ah, muchas
ejemplo para los
gracias.
otros capítulos que estamos comenzando.
Ok,
Ah,
muchas
excelente. ¿Tú dónde estás?
Yo soy venezolano, pero estoy en Vancouver en este momento.
gracias.
Ah,
Ya.
mira, qué buena onda.
Sí, sí.
Te voy a
Pero
dejar
estoy viendo
aquí
ahorita ustedes. Ok,
te voy a dejar el correo del capítulo para que nos escribas en unos días a ver cómo vamos con eso. ¿Qué te parece?
ok, excelente, muchas gracias.
Sí. Y
Va
bueno,
para...
aquí en el chat tenemos algunas preguntas de Rosa y de Alberto. Sí, justamente los invitamos a que se afilien a la ACBS. Allí
Isa.
en el Facebook pueden encontrar un video en el que les estamos explicando paso a paso cómo afiliarse. Pueden afiliarse desde 300 pesos anuales, que son $15. Y bueno, ya que estén ustedes afiliados, se pueden ustedes agregar a nuestra listserv, a nuestra lista de correos, y en automático, pues nosotros les estaríamos enviando invitaciones y publicidades de las cosas que vamos haciendo acá, cosas para miembros y también cosas en general, ¿no? Entonces, sí, los invitamos amablemente a que se integren a la comunidad. Ahí estamos creciendo y sería bueno vernos crecer más todavía, ¿no? Entonces recuerden en redes, se encuentran como ahí el link para poder inscribirse. Am, ok, y acá,
Nayetka, Nayetka, ¿nos puedes escribir en una semana más o menos? Porfis. Y ya vemos cómo va el asunto este. ¿Sale? Gracias. Y ya te mandamos el material si es que ya está.
ujú, perfecto.
Estoy buscando el videíto que nos hizo Gerson a ver si lo puedo pasar por aquí donde vienen las instrucciones para afiliarse, pero no lo encuentro. O no sé si alguien ya lo mandó.
Mm, sí, no lo tenemos ahorita creo que a la mano, pero
Ya lo
seguro que...
tengo.
Ah, ok,
Aquí,
Ya
aquí
lo
gracias.
lo tengo a
mandaron.
la mano. No, 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 se los...
Ah, ya lo mandó Jenny.
¿Ya lo mandó Jenny?
Sí. Ok, entonces sí, en ese videíto pues se explica. Acá
Ahí
también
está. Ujú.
está.
Este es el tutorial específicamente.
Ujú. Sí, así es, Alan,
Dice,
para
ajá,
afiliarte acá al chapter, en donde dice, bueno, donde tú das de alta a los otros chapters a los que te quieres afiliar, nada más pones palomita. Bueno, ahí aparecemos nosotros, Chapter México Sur, y puedes afiliarte a todos los que tú quieras. Ujú,
ujú.
ujú. Bien. No sé si
Ya para que les lleguen directamente los correos con con la publicidad de los eventos. Nosotros periódicamente les mandamos correos y ya, ahí a la mano.
Ujú, perfecto. No sé si haya más dudas, comentarios, quejas, sugerencias, todo es bienvenido en estos momentos.
Ujú. Gracias, César, también, que se la estuvo rifando ahí durante 2 horas.
Exacto.
Gracias, César, por tu ayuda. ¿Y ahorita a las 2 te vas a conectar para el grupo de estudio o ya no? Ah,
¿Sí?
sí, mira.
Ah, ok,
Yo pensé
perfecto.
que te ibas a dar el día. Pues bueno, César también está coordinando un grupo de estudio para las personas que están aquí por primera vez y se están enterando acerca de las actividades. Están leyendo un libro, ¿verdad? Y bueno, se reúnen cada sábado también, entre otras actividades que pues hay también en el capítulo. Por eso le preguntábamos ahorita. Pero bueno, les dejamos el enlace y si se quieren añadir, pues ahí les esperamos.
Vale. Pues muchísimas gracias nuevamente. Disfruten su sábado y nos vemos en las siguientes emisiones. Bonito día, cuídense a todas, a todos.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Nos vemos,
Gracias.
Alberto.
Hasta luego.
Bye.
Ah, deteniendo la reunión aquí, se acaba la transmisión en Zoom y en Facebook, ¿no? Digo, en YouTube. Ah, bueno, entonces ya la concluimos.
Perfecto.
¿Sales, vales? Pues gracias, nos vemos en la
Cuídense.
próxima. Gracias.